Hello, everybody, and welcome back to episode 6 of Classic Rock Revisited. We had a bit of a hiatus because of school, going to Zoom University here, and I'm sure my co host Ryan can relate to all the struggles with that. But we're back and we're here to talk about one of the most influential and important albums in rock history, which is Thriller by Michael Jackson, the king of pop himself. And joining me today, once again, is Ryan Woodhams.
How you doing, guys? Hope everybody's staying well.
And before we kind of jump into the album today, I wish this was something that was an isolated incident, but what's been dominating the headlines the last couple days is the shooting of Jacob Blake, who is a citizen who was trying to break up a fight in Kenosha and was shot 7 times in the back. A black man in America who didn't commit a crime at that moment, with another brutal attack from the police. And we just like to offer our sympathy for for their community right now in Kenosha, and anybody who's struggling because of these events or have seen all these events in the headlines. Um, it's heartbreaking.
It is. And to go one step further than that, I think that in every situation it that arises, I think there's something meaningful to be taken, positive or negative. And I think during this pandemic, I think one positive, well, positive with an asterisk, of course, but I think one thing that I take away from this is that the fact that these tragic tragedies have occurred during the setting of this pandemic, it has allowed the full light of scrutiny to go squarely on this, which I don't believe was the case before. I think, um, un- unfortunately and wrongfully so, these situations would end up dominating the headlines for a few days, and then it was not, there wasn't really a follow up to that. And I think now, hopefully, what this sort of time period and these recent tragedies can allow for is that these people did not pass in vain, and these people are and their memories and their legacies are what are going to move forward and be sort of a grounding point that allows us to have more real dialogue going forward as to how we can better stand in solidarity with our brothers and sisters across this country to not have a society where anybody feels like those who should be protecting them are any sort of an adversary to them or their brothers and sisters.
Hmm. Yeah, you said it perfectly, and I think it's important to remember all these names: Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery. There's been so many countless deaths this year, and that's just kind of the that's just kind of the top of what we've seen. I mean, there's so many different instances of black men and women being killed solely because of their race, and we're trying our best to uh, become informed on the situation and help in any way we can, sign any petitions, and show support in any way we can. Obviously, there's always more that we can do. And if you're listening to this right now, I hope you can take action as well, because actions speak louder than words. And I think we can all agree that this is just a terrible situation and that racism like this has been existing for hundreds and hundreds of years. It's just the form in which it's taken has changed, not really the content of it. So hopefully that there will be a better tomorrow and that there will be more understanding and empathy. But in the meantime, we mourn with everybody who's struggling right now. And
Well, and
yeah, go ahead.
I think that that's one component of being an American in today's society, um, as I hope continues to be true and becomes even more true going forward, is um, we're all in this together. And it's the pandemic is hitting us all simultaneously, and this is affecting all of us either directly or affecting the people that we love and that we consider our brothers and sisters. And going forward, it's a fight that demands attention from people across boundaries.
100%. So before we get started here, I'm just gonna have a look at a little bit of moment of silence for all the lives lost this year due to police brutality and all the lives that have been lost in years prior. Unfortunately, there isn't really any good way to transition past that. But today we're going to be talking about one of the most influential albums in history, and one that was fronted by somebody who was not quite new to the music scene, but somebody who revolutionized the music scene for a black man in America, and that's Michael Jackson. So, what I found fascinating about this album was this was the first. They had the first single in history that had a black artist on MTV. It was widely dominated by a lot of European bands like Def Leppard. Obviously, the Beatles would be one of those from Britain, and plenty of other bands like that. And Michael Jackson was truly a pioneer, and he teamed up with Quincy Jones for this album for Thriller. And right now, it's the best-selling album of all time, 65 million copies, which it's really hard to wrap your head around, like how insane that is for any artist to achieve, let alone a pop artist who was part of like a boy band when he was a child. So even though there's a lot of controversy about Michael Jackson and his personal life, I think we can all agree that he was just a revolutionary talent.
Wholeheartedly agree with that sentiment, as well as I think that when you think about Michael Jackson, he wasn't just a musician, and not to take anything away from musicians in general, because that talent and that commitment obviously takes a lifetime to perfect, to continue to hone, and to portray and deliver to the rest of the world. But there was the choreography that went with his musicianship. There was the theatrics. There was the attire. He had so much of a persona that and a celebrity that went hand in hand with that musical talent and that musical legendary stature that he had brought himself to. Um, that I think he you when you think of Michael Jackson, he was so much more than just an elite singer and songwriter.
Yeah, and there was so much inspiration that he brought people, and there's so many ways you can interpret his music. You can just have fun with it. You can dance, you can groove, you can sing along to a lot of the choruses, especially on this album. Uh, but also just the fact that he was able to break away from what was an abusive childhood and have a really really successful career. It's fascinating, and obviously those difficulties uh, struggle made him struggle in his personal life. But as far as his music goes, just what he's just a incredible artist, like I said before, and his impact is still being felt today. I mean, you can't go to a Halloween party and not hear Thriller. You can't turn on 101.1 and not hear Beat It or Billie Jean. So I think this is probably, if not the most important, one of the most important albums of music history. And I mean, there's plenty of stats to back it up as well. This album is just loaded.
It is, and I believe that it's like you said, like you look at some elite albums throughout the course of rock history or music history or pop history, whatever the genre you want to look at, and you can have two, three elite songs, and it makes the album a masterpiece. If I look at you look through the set list of this this album, there's five, six songs that are just household names on one album, and it doesn't even encapsulate some of his greatest hits. And I think that that just kind of ties up in a neat little bow just how versatile and how lengthy his career was, and how he kept producing just gem after gem upon gem.
Yeah, and I never sat down and listened to the album all the way through until the last couple weeks. But when I listened to it and I looked through the track listing, there was only one song in there that I hadn't heard before. So, like you were saying, this is just such a blockbuster of an album, and there's so many hits, and it could be a greatest hits album for most artists. But for him, it's just one of his best, you know?
Just another day at the office.
Exactly. So, without
Or
further ado, we're just
or the
gonna.
studio in the studio in this case.
Exactly. So, we're just gonna jump right into it. Let's go track by track, and it starts with Wanna Be Starting Something, which is an awesome way to open the album.
All right. Thank you, Noah. So, upon that lead in, I'll actually start off by saying that this was actually my least favorite song on the entire record. Uh, he's, he's
That's
looking at
a quite the juxtaposition.
he's looking at me now with that sort of mind blown meme type look. Um, and that's not to say that I dislike the song in any way, shape, or form. It just definitely was my least favorite. It comes in with the classic MJ intro. So you start the first 10, 15 seconds of this song. It's very beat oriented. It's very just sort of doo-wop music, and just that unique style of, you just can picture him getting up with his one glove uh, on the on the stage and breaking into his signature dance moves. Um, the one thing I will, or one of the things I will say about the song is that I did find the lyrics quite repetitive, which I think for a song that spans over 6 minutes, I think that kind of where it's where it lost me a little bit. We've talked about songs in the past by other artists like Billy Joel's "Scenes from an Italian Restaurant." I think songs like that are very versatile and have a lot of shape shifting, make it easier to span those expanded durations. I just That was one drawback for the song for me. I think it kind of outlasted its own lyrics a little bit. One interesting fact as well is there was actually a French musician that I found when I was actually researching the backstory of the song. He actually was There was actually a lawsuit that was settled against Michael Jackson's um, people upon the recording of this song for the coda that was actually taken and pretty much riffed from a previous recording by a French musician that, as I mentioned, was later on settled. So I found that just kind of an interesting non-musical tidbit, but I definitely like the song. It's something that if it was put on at a party, I would definitely get up and dance to it, and I would apologize later to everybody else who was at that party. Um, but at the same time, it would probably be one of my least favorites on here, just because I have a hard time with some of those expanded 5 6 minute tracks if I feel like there's not a lot of originality that keeps the verses fresh and very alive. Um, but again, it's catchy, and it definitely makes you want to get up and groove.
Yeah, and I liked your point about the dancing. I would definitely not partake in that because I would not want to embarrass myself. Uh, I
I just
think
don't care.
I think I have the rhythm down, but the fact that I look like Slender Man is a bit of an issue. Anyways, I guess it was a bit strong to say that it's an awesome opener. It's like perfect, but I do think this is a great way to define what the rest of the album looks like. Right out of the gate, it just like punches you in the face, and you know exactly what you're in for in regards to the album. And it's such a high energy, tight album. It is quite interesting that they did have a 6 minute ish song to kick it off, considering that the album is 9 songs, 36 minutes, which in the context of other albums is probably a little bit shorter. Uh, but yeah, I think this is one of those songs on the album. We'll get into a couple more examples later, but where the beat is a lot more interesting and a lot more important than the lyrics. I believe Stevie Wonder, or no, it was Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys, was quoted saying that it doesn't matter what the lyrics are about. I'm kind of fudging up the quote here, but the lyrical content doesn't quite matter as much as what the song is doing on an instrumental level, on a sonic level, basically everything else, all the meat and potatoes of the song. So there's parts in the song where they're saying "you're a vegetable" repeatedly, and "mama say, mama sa, mamakusa." So it's not quite something that you can really break down and have a whole music theory class on as far as the lyricism. But I love the energy, and I love how exclusively Michael Jackson it is. There's there hasn't been any other artist that has matched like the charisma that he has on stage. I think since the 1980s when Michael Jackson became so prominent. So that kind of does it for the first track. But now we're gonna head into track number two, and that's "Baby Be Mine."
All right, so "Baby Be Mine," I enjoyed this one quite a bit. There's a bit of a tempo decrease, which I thought was kind of interesting. How he kind of contrasted that between "Want to Be Starting Something" and "Baby Be Mine." Uh, I like that this song was a little more centric around the vocals, which again is in contrast to the first track. Uh, I did enjoy the instrumentalism on the first track. I saw I always see a lot of value in an artist really playing with the vocals in a very unique way, and I felt like this was one of those tracks where he definitely went that route. I felt like it was more earnest. Now you hear a title like "Baby Be Mine," and you start to think, "Oh, is this going to be a very cliche love song?" And I thought that it did a great job of towing the line on the side of remaining traditional, but not being so cliche and staying fresh enough that it really didn't become a cliche type song. And I think the favorite part of the song or my favorite part of the song rather, would be when he comes toward the end and says, "Lady, can't you see that heaven's just begun? It's living here inside our hearts. There'll be no more mountains for us to climb. I can't be still. You thrill me, baby, be mine. This will be a love lasting for all time." And I just think that in those lyrics, like "heaven's just begun," it's living here inside our hearts. That's just there's something so brilliant about that. And as someone who is always a sucker for a good love song, but also is very cliche wary in music, especially in the pop genre where you kind of hear a lot of artists saying almost the same thing. I thought that this was just a very unique and sort of old school type way of portraying that in a very classy manner, and I really appreciated that. So I enjoyed "Baby Be Mine," and I definitely thought that coming off of the intro track, I thought this was a really fresh and interesting way to continue the album into closer to the middle of the set list.
Yeah, and it's not exactly reinventing the wheel, but the wheel's nice and shiny and buffed and has a bunch of sparkles on it. I love how the production is on this track. And right out of the gates, when you go from that drum solo to kind of the lower tempo and that thick groove, I love the contrast there. Uh, I think this is probably my favorite vocal performance from Michael Jackson on this whole album. And like you said, it's nothing amazing in the context of the album, but the fact that this is maybe the sixth or seventh best that this one has to offer, if I was like an artist and I released this song, this would definitely be my best. This would be most artists I think in the world would probably say this is something that would eclipse a lot of what they've put out. And for him, it was just one of the lesser known tracks.
Hmm.
So I was pleasantly surprised by this one. I really enjoyed it, and I think it's a great way to maintain a bit of the energy from the first track, but it makes a really nice transition into the third track, which we'll talk about in a second. So we might as well jump into it now. So the third track, we have a feature from Paul McCartney, one of my favorite artists of all time, and it's "The Girl's Mind."
Okay, so there were a handful of songs that I had never heard before you we sat down and discussed doing this episode, and this was one of them, and it has now become one of my favorite Michael Jackson songs. I absolutely love this track. I love the overlay and the duet with Paul McCartney, who I enjoy as a musician more as a soloist and with the Wings personally. One of the more controversial things I guess that I would say is that I'm not really a fan of the Beatles very much, um, but I very much enjoyed his inclusion on this.
I'm punching the air right now. I love the Beatles, and
Yeah.
I've been listening to the White Album nonstop. But I'll let you continue.
Okay. So one of the things that growing up I've really come to enjoy is this sort of coffee house type vibe on an evening, a Wednesday evening or a Friday evening, depending on where I've been, and just kind of sitting back with some friends, kind of decompressing and listening to some live music. And this really puts on that type of vibe of just a guy going up and serenading, the love of his life with this song. I thought that there was you mentioned how in the lead-off track for you it was just a very Michael Jackson way to open the album. I thought that this track in particular included a very Michael Jackson type move, which that was the inclusion on the repeated chorus line of the word doggone when he says the doggone girl is mine. I that's just not a term that I really hear in music very much. But if someone told me like to associate this for some reason with an artist, it would probably be Michael Jackson. It's just something that I can definitely hear him saying. Another component is early on in this track, they have something that normally I abhor in music, which is the snap track as a means of percussion. But particularly in this day and age where it's kind of ruining a lot of country music over the last 5 years, which is my favorite genre, but that's for another podcast. Um, I think the snap track in this particular song is so very authentic sounding and well
It's
used.
classy.
It's classy. It doesn't sound mechanical. It doesn't sound overproduced. This song kind of almost, not from a musical or instrumental standpoint, but from a lyrical standpoint, you get a little bit of PYT vibes from this song a little bit. Um, and I enjoy that because I'm also a fan of PYT, but I'm not going to spoil that part of the episode. But I absolutely love, this girl is mine, and it's definitely going to be part of my regular rotation going forward.
Yeah, this was one of the first Michael Jackson songs I think I was kind of exposed to because, like I said, I love the Beatles, and when I was little, I loved the Beatles and Michael Jackson. Those were my two bands. I later on I kind of became acquainted with the Killers, and then I had a Fall Out Boy phase. We won't talk about that, but
We all did.
we all do have that. Some people have Panic at the Disco. Some people have Linkin Park. Everybody has that phase.
I had
But
all three.
I digress. Anyway, The Girl Is Mine. I think this is a really solid track. Not necessarily my favorite on the album, but like I said, if this was on any other album, it would be one of the biggest hits. And I believe this is the first single they released or the second single they released. Um, and I would go out on a limb and say this is probably the most underrated track that they have on here. And I really like how they contrast the first two songs, like I said, which were high energy. Want to Be Starting Something is such a jolt of energy to start the album. Then you kind of bring it back a little bit on Baby Be Mine. And this song kind of feels like a yacht rock, like you said, coffee shop kind of song where you can just listen to it and unwind. It almost feels like when I listen to this album, especially with a good pair of headphones on, it's like my shoulders are starting to ease and I start like sinking a little deeper into my seat. And yeah, I love the feature on here with Paul McCartney. I could have done without the outro. I think after the first couple times, I was like, oh, this is cute. Like, this is nice. A little way to end the song. And then now that I've listened to the album like 4 or 5 times, I'm just like, okay, I can skip the last 30 seconds. I
Yeah.
don't know how you felt about that.
Yeah, I think that I can see where you're coming from. But again, I think this album was a little bit newer to me, at least on a whole, than it was to you. So maybe I didn't quite get that vibe. Um, but speaking of outros, this next one's got one of the most iconic ones of all time. So um, I'll let you kick it off.
Yeah, let's just go right into it. The fourth track on here is the Halloween classic Thriller.
So Thriller used to be one of my least favorite songs. Fun fact. And that was entirely because the first time that I was exposed to this track, I was much younger. I don't remember how old I was. And my first time was not just the song. I saw the music video, and the music video absolutely freaked me out.
I was gonna
Um,
say the exact same thing. Oh my gosh, that music video was like the scariest
That
thing I'd
that
ever
was
seen when I was
terrifying
like
to me.
6 years old.
Yeah, I think I was probably 8 or 9 when I saw it. Um, but it just, like you said, it just became a Halloween classic. In fact, I think that after a period of time where I refused to listen to the song, I think that the first time in a while that I had heard it, it was actually on Halloween, and if someone's house that I went to high school with, and um, I think my favorite part of the song, aside from of course, the iconic Vincent Price outro where he starts with "Darkness falls across the land," and I'm not going to read that whole thing. But
You
aside from
already know it. You've heard it 1,000 times. The
right,
viewers
right,
at home.
aside from that, where he's just got the unique, very gravelly, smoky, eerie voice at the end that kind of brings to mind the Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. At least in my mind. Aside from that, I think my favorite part is just the final repetition of the chorus after he does the Thriller line and he says, "Baby, I can thrill you more than any ghost would ever dare try." There's so much energy to that, and I think that was probably my favorite line in this because it's such a unique way of just kind of combining the sort of fear and intensity and the sort of approaching doom and impending doom of the song, but also saying like, "Hey, there's some love here," and "Hey, cling to me, I'll get you," and we'll make the most of this. Um, there's an intensity for that I have to belt that part out every time I sing this song. Um, and I think Thriller, I don't like being, when I listen to albums, I try to, especially albums that are iconic, I try to listen to them and think, if I were a real fan of this person, not just someone who just knows the classics and doesn't listen to any of the backlist stuff, what would my favorite song be on this album? But there's no way to say it. This is my opinion, the easily my favorite song on this album. So I'm going to be a bit of a mainstream guy here. Um, but
There's
yeah,
no problem with that. If it
Thriller
ain't
just
broke, don't fix it.
absolutely, and it's iconic, and it's got me. It's definitely going to be played at Halloween for me this year. Whether that's with other people around 6 feet away from me and up in costume, or whether I'm just kicking back and wondering what's going to happen in the next football game.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to listen to this while I'm on my couch in a Batman onesie eating M&Ms alone this year, so that's going to be great. But it's interesting. This is kind of first of all, I love this song. I think it's great. But whenever I think about this song, I always think of Halloween. It's so iconic, and this is like one of the songs that is so integral to my childhood. Obviously, I kind of alluded to it earlier, where I've had so many scary memories of watching it when I was little. It was one of those things where I was scared of it, but I kept on going back to it because I was like, I'm gonna show that I'm like strong, and I'm gonna get through. I'm gonna get all through the 7 or 8 minutes or however long it may be. But this is just such a great classic Michael Jackson song, and you said it was your favorite on the album. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Sometimes it's the most popular one that's the best one. With Fleetwood Mac, The Chain, everybody knows The Chain. That doesn't mean it's necessarily not in their top 10
Hmm.
because it's so well done, and that's why it has such a wide appeal. But one of the other things I was thinking of on the topic of Fleetwood Mac, Thriller is the one song on this album that doesn't really fit as well with the other songs. Kind of in the way that Tusk on Fleetwood Mac, their record Tusk, it seems so out of left field, even though it's the title track of the album. Because you get to track 19 on there, and then Tusk starts playing. You're like, this doesn't feel like it belongs. Like this feels so random and out there. And in the same way, with Thriller, it doesn't exactly fit the same vibe as Beat It and Billie Jean and Baby Be Mine and Wanna Be Starting Something because it's so moody and it almost feels like it could be on like a concept album.
I definitely see where you're coming from there, but I will just say this, sort of tongue in cheek, as someone who spent a good year of their life at playing left field, there's nothing wrong with coming out of left field.
Exactly. Coming out of left field is underrated. I honestly, and I think it makes the album better because right when you think you know where things are going, you get hit with a curveball.
Hmm.
So, and also this is what begins the iconic big three on this album, which 4, 5, and 6. I mean, this is a heavy hitting trio right here coming up. And we're just going to jump into the second part of that trio, which is Beat It, the fifth track on the album.
Okay, so this was the first song that I ever knew by Michael Jackson. Beat It. I was first exposed to this playing. I'll never forget. It was Guitar Hero. It was world. It was one of the World Tour games that I had on my Nintendo Wii back when that was popular.
Heck yeah.
Um, and whether I was playing guitar, drums, singing, or attempting to sing, whatever it was, I this was my go-to song playing that game for years on years. I've got very fond memories of that. I also I think that just growing up when we did, I think that we have to give a shout out here, kind of on the side swipe, to Weird Al Yankovic for his parody "Eat It."
Yes.
Um,
Yes. You're just
I,
reading my mind today.
I think that that's that definitely was iconic when you and I were coming up, and it became a staple of his vocal style, but just the Michael Jackson hiccups on here. There's just certain vocal just nuances and genius sort of tricks in the toolbox that different artists have. With Randy Travis, it's his kind of very effortless drawl, and with with Bruce Springsteen, it's kind of his very gravelly, tough blue collar voice, and with Michael Jackson, it's that type of ability to. As someone who's tried to sing Michael Jackson songs in karaoke before, there's just some artists you can't cover in certain ways, and he's just
And that
you just
grit
can't.
is so hard to
It
match, I
is.
think.
It is, and you just cannot, especially with the smooth, suave nature of the way that he performs the choreography during these tracks. It's a unique thing to watch, and I'm grateful that some of it's been archived for generations, with on the internet, because I definitely can really appreciate it. You don't really get the full Michael Jackson effect, I think, until you can actually watch some of these in music videos or on MTV. Um, some of this in live uh, production.
Definitely. And I'm so glad you gave Weird Al Yankovic a shout out because I love Weird Al Yankovic and Trapped in the Drive-Thru, Eat It, Fat, all those songs. Those are just such a staple in my childhood. But as far as the original song, also rather good. I think this is where the album takes a turn from being pop, kind of funk, disco album into becoming a rock album, really. And that's partially due to Van Halen's insane guitar solo in the song. I don't think there's many other guitar solos in any song in history that are as iconic as this. And I think that just shows the breadth that this album has, where you're covering so many different genres and you're trying out so many different things instead of just being a straightforward mainstream pop record. So this is probably the hardest he goes on the album, and I think that's mostly due to that Van Halen guitar solo. But I love how intense and passionate this song is, and like I said before, there's a reason why these songs are so popular and they connect with so many different people. Also, one thing I think is worth mentioning with this album is just the incredible diversity that was brought upon by the crew and everybody who was involved in making this album. Obviously, as we mentioned earlier, Michael Jackson was one of the probably the biggest black artists of that time. And also you had Quincy Jones, who was a wonderful producer. And Van Halen and Paul McCartney had their contributions. And then in the music videos for Beat It, Thriller, and I believe one other track on here might be on Off the Wall. There's such a celebration of so many different cultures and people coming together. You have people who are Hispanic, Asian, white, black. It doesn't matter. Everybody has a role in these songs and in the music videos. And I think that's a beautiful thing. And especially at a time where that would have been so difficult to push. It's it just holds up incredibly well, and I'm so glad. It makes me so happy that this album was released in the 1980s and had such an impact and sold so many copies, because now everybody in the world could see all these different people coming together and creating good music. And that brings us into the last of the big three here in the middle of the album, and that's Billie Jean.
Okay. If any of my family listens to this podcast, they're not going to let me forget about one memory that will live on forever that correlates with this song. So about 3 years ago, 2 years ago actually, 2 years ago, I apologize. My cousin got married to someone who currently plays tight end for the Buffalo Bills, uh, your team,
Heck
um,
yeah, Bill's
and
Mafia.
Bills Mafia. And at that wedding, I'm not going to get too much into details here, but I will say um, events happened, and I was a little out of my mind that evening. Um, a few minutes into the reception,
You weren't in the
and
driver's seat.
yeah, I was not in the driver's seat. Absolutely.
Okay.
I think there's an argument to say that I spend most of my life in the passenger seat, but uh, we won't go into that. So anyway, uh, the all of a sudden I hear Billie Jean come on. This is only the third or fourth time I'd heard this song, but I enjoyed it, and obviously you just the opening sort of do 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 as soon as you get into that sort of uh, compartment where or that portion where you know that the vocals are about to break out, it
Oh, it's
just
on at that point.
it, you're gone at that point. And here I go up onto the dance floor doing my best moonwalk that I possibly could, which is not a very good moonwalk, with multiple couples, drinks in hand, standing right around me.
Oh no.
Um, and let's just say I uh, I tried to subvert Newton's law that says that two uh, individuals or two objects cannot occupy the same space at the same time. Um, and it kind of all was downhill from
Oh
there.
man,
And
this
my
imagery
parents
is just too much right now.
and my parents did what every Italian teenager's parents would do. They break out their phones and start recording everything and laughing their you know what's off. So uh, yep, 2 years later, and I'm sure that it'll be many more years before that story stops being told. So I thought I'd share it with you guys. Um, but
That sounds
yeah,
like a classic Thanksgiving story right there.
but it's that's what I think of when I think of this song. Is I have a lot of fond memories of just getting up and dancing, and then of course um, that particular event. And that, but going back to the actual lyrics of the song, it's very it doesn't really follow a traditional pop formula. Like you hear about exes or ex lovers or current lovers or love interests. You don't really hear about a performer singing about I suppose, a groupie or someone that they meet on the road while performing, claiming that their child is that of this particular artist. That's just not a story we usually get, and I think that this makes this song very unique, and it kind of sets it apart. And I think that was part of the brilliance of Michael Jackson from a lyrical standpoint. Is he sometimes he was just saying things that everybody else was saying, but in a just very classical and uh, very style that was true to him, that was kind of separate and lifted out of what the mainstream was at the time. And at other times, he just goes off in a completely different direction, into a territory where nobody was. And, they sort of he was playing chess when everybody else was playing checkers. And
For sure.
I really enjoy that about this track. It's a little bit lower for me now, only because between this one and Beat It, I've heard it so many times over the last 2 years, but that did not take away from the brilliance of the lyrics, of the musical production of it, or of the fond memories that it holds.
Yeah, I think it falls victim to what I call "Don't Stop Believing" itis, where it
Yes.
plays on 101.1 or any other classic radio station at least 10 times a day. I think Tiny Dancer is also another victim of that, unfortunately, because I love that song so much. So if we're just going to take away the slightly overplayed factor here, it's an incredible song. And it's lyrically and production wise very impressive stuff. I love how this song is so singable and danceable. And if you go to a party and you hear this song, everybody has to sing along. If you're at like a family gathering and this song plays, like everybody stops what they're doing and they're dancing and they're singing. And there's so many tracks like that on this album, just in general. But another thing I really enjoy about it as well is it's just dripping with swagger and mystery, and like it has such a cloud around it where it's so intriguing that even though you hear it all the time and it gets a little tiring after a while, it's still revisitable. And I can't really say that about some of the other songs that fall under the "Don't Stop Believing" itis issue. So Billie Jean, it's just another great feather in his cap for this album, and yeah, I like the mysterious vibe of it, and I like the production here. This album is just perfect to listen to with a great set of headphones, where you really just get the effect on both ears and the shifting dynamics for the music. So, I mean, what else can I say that hasn't been said before? It's a great track.
It really is. And I think that kind of ability of it to teeter on that ledge of, as you call, uh, don't stop believing itis, but not complete, maybe not completely falling off of it entirely. I think that kind of shows how it's one of those tracks that, while it may be one that you don't play as much, if it comes on at a random time, you're
You
rarely
stop what
gonna,
you're doing.
yeah, you're rarely gonna click it off or tune it out to go on your phone and scroll through Instagram.
Definitely, I agree. And now that we've talked about Billie Jean, that brings us into, I say, the second ballad on this album, which is "Human Nature."
So, as a self-styled sucker for lyricism, a little bit of alliteration there. This song, just the first verse, the uh, the imagery of this, where almost you don't even need to see a music video. You can almost direct one in your own mind because of the way that these lyrics are put out, looking out across the nighttime, sweet seducing sighs, which that's not an adjective that is often put in that type of context. And I think that was why it really grabbed my attention, because he plays with words in settings where everyone else is just going into these sort of grab jars of music material. He's just kind of he's reaching, and a lot of times he's hitting a home run with them. And then four walls won't hold me tonight. If this town is just an apple, then let me take a bite. Man,
Love that line.
I mean, what can you say about that? And this kind of gave me, if you take, and I got to mention my all-time favorite here. If you take "My Hometown" by Bruce Springsteen and you kind of add a love interest into the mix, I feel like this is the type of song that you get, because he's very aware of where he is right now, and how sort of dark and very, um, at the risk of being too extreme, desolate, his current situation, current surroundings are. He's reaching for something that he can't in that moment have for one reason or another. In my hometown's place, it was a location. In this place, it's a woman, And I think that the way throughout the song he's incessant and he is persistent and reaching out. I touch her shoulder. I'm dreaming of the street when the city's heart begins to beat. As he puts in group three, or I'm sorry, verse three, not group three. It becomes more palpable to the point where, again, you're almost back in that sort of music video where you can almost, if you can't physically feel these things, you can at least visualize them to the pixel, which I think is quite fascinating and quite remarkable.
Yeah, definitely. I think you brought up some really great points there, especially with the Bruce Springsteen shout out there. I can definitely see that. And I remember thinking that this was the most profound song I'd ever heard in my entire life when I was 10 and I loved Michael Jackson. And it still holds up today, surprisingly. There's a lot of songs I listened to when I was younger that I thought were a lot deeper than they actually were. But I think in this case, it does hold up quite well. And I also like how it slows down things after that big three, but it doesn't quite slow to a stop. And the lyricism here is great, and also, like you said, the imagery. It allows you to kind of put together everything in your head instead of explicitly showing it in a video, which I think would take away from it.
It's kind of a prolonged decrescendo into the final, the sort of swan song of the album.
Uh huh, definitely. So that kind of concludes Human Nature, which is the seventh track, which brings us to the final leg of this album, which is a 1-2 punch where I really love one of them and the other one doesn't quite land for me. But let's just head into number 8, and that's Pretty Young Thing, also known as PYT.
Um, I actually there's some songs, and even if they're not among my favorite songs, there's certain songs that they're such an earworm, and they're so catchy that I can remember exactly where I was, what I was doing, etc. When I first heard them. That's the case with this one. I was in an Uber at school, and this song came on, and I knew that I had heard the song before, but I never knew what it was. Didn't know uh, what the name was or any of the lyrics really. But you just knew that you knew that song somehow, and that's how I felt about PYT when it came on. Uh, it's it's a very repetitive song. It's in contrast to songs I mentioned earlier. Like This Girl Is Mine, I could probably put on repeat a few times. PYT is like I hear it, and then I kind of need to sit back and kind of take a breath for a second because it's so energized and but it's all the up tempo nature and how profound the lyrics are and how profound the message that he's trying to convey to this woman is on top of the tempo, the intensity, the passion. There's so much coming out of it that I think makes sense why you needed a song between Billie Jean and this track, like Human Nature, where it was a bit, like you said, a bit of a ballad. Because when you listen to a song like Billie Jean, you kind of, it's very similar to when you dance to a song like Billie Jean. You kind of got to, all right, now you got to come off the dance floor, not,
Take a drink,
yeah,
slow down a little bit.
well, unfortunately, I took that advice a little too literally, but, uh, Uh, but I, step off the dance floor, kind of get your bearings a little bit, and then you'll go back out later. And I think the song that you go back out later to is definitely PYT. And then once you're done with that, you kind of have to take a break again, and then at that point, you're kind of wrapping it up for the night and going home with, presumably whoever is being sung about in this particular track. His passion and his direct ability, because there's certain songs on here that, like you said, they're very up for interpretation. You can kind of almost make of the song whatever it feels to you.
There's a bit of a
This is
vagueness to it.
Yeah. This one I felt like was the opposite. I felt like this one was more concerted. This one was more clear of, hey, you don't know exactly who it's about, but he's got his eye on one specific person. This isn't just about like I want somebody. This is I want this person for these reasons, and this is and he's kind of focusing his passion and his eye into this one individual. It's a really well done song, and this is the type of track. This is also aside from Man in the Mirror and uh, Beat It. This was this was kind of when I hadn't been into Michael Jackson for a while, but starting to get back into him. This was the song that kind of kicked that off, and then I got into ones like "Don't Stop Till You Get Enough," "Black or White," that appear on other albums.
Yeah, I think this is definitely my favorite song on the album thus far. And it's so rare that you can find a song that's second to last on an album that's like truly the standout. It's kind of like if you have your best hitter batting eighth. You wouldn't really quite expect that on a baseball roster. You wouldn't quite expect that on an album either. Uh, but yeah, I love how joyous this track is and how bombastic and dynamic and so like enthusiastic. There's so many different adjectives I could think of to describe it, and it sounds very in line with a lot of the tracks we've seen earlier in the album, but it just seems like it takes it a step further, and everything's just escalating to a point where there's just this complete burst of energy. And I really like how a lot of these songs on this album have kind of a call and response format to it. So it makes it so easy to listen to with a group of people, or like if you're on a boat, or if you're in a shop, or if you're basically in any public setting. It's such a great song to sing along to and dance along to, and there's so many tracks like that on this album that make it really feel like a celebration of all these different types of genres of music, especially disco and funk. And yeah, I could talk all day about this track. I think this and Rock With You are probably at the top of my list as favorite Michael Jackson tracks. And once again, just another great addition to this album.
I'm just gonna say, if you ever see Mike Trout batting eighth in a lineup, please tell me that Brett Ausmus does not have a job by the next morning.
I think Joe Madden, I wouldn't put it past Joe Madden at this point.
Or I'm sorry, Joe Madden. I apologize. I had a brain lapse there.
You're good. It's just the same soup reheated every year with the Angels. Just third place. Actually, they're worse this year. Anyway, I'm not going to get heated on the podcast here.
Yeah.
So that brings us into the last track on this album, and unfortunately, this is probably the track that leaves the least impact on me, and that's "The Lady in My Life."
I would agree with that sentiment. I think it. You know how there are some songs on different albums that are just elevated by where they are in the set list, and they are elevated by what's around them and how they're placed and such. I think that this song is done a disservice by where it's played, because when you first of all you look at other songs that were put into this particular track. You have, I'm sorry, into this particular record. You have "Baby Be Mine." You have "Wanna Be Starting Something." You have "This Girl Is Mine." Um, "Thriller," if you want to count that, and then um, "PYT." I think that to close the album with a song like "The Lady in My Life," which I think fits Michael Jackson's vibe and persona perhaps the least out of anybody, I'm sorry, out of any of these tracks in terms of just songs that I would associate with him and that sound Michael Jackson-ish, for lack of a better way of phrasing that. Um, I I I thought that this was kind of a bit of uh, a low point that was kind of it was I believe it was just done a disservice by its placement, and I'm not a huge fan of the song in general. I believe that it's one of those songs like sometimes, and I see this a lot in country music recently, where I absolutely, if I don't love, I do genuinely like aspects of a song, but I just know that it was meant to be written or performed at least by somebody else. And I just think that for this particular track, if it had perhaps a different uh, face behind the lyrics and a different voice um, behind the music, it might have been a little bit more impactful. And if it were placed differently in the set list, if it closed out perhaps um, with a Baby Be Mine, if maybe it was switched with Baby Be Mine and Baby Be Mine went here at a level where it kind of was um, low key. It was more of a relaxed to kind of counteract PYT. Um, that might have resonated a little bit more with me. It just did not land heavily for me when I listened to it for this podcast. Uh, but again, it's like you said earlier. There are there's songs on here that might be the fourth or fifth best song on this record that other artists don't achieve that type of a hit in their entire careers. So the fact that The Lady in My Life might be one of the two least exciting or least interesting or least um, appreciated songs on this record by you and myself, I think does more to speak about exactly how much came before it um, and some of the logistics of the track and its production and the set list more so than it says anything specific about what actually came out in the content of the song itself.
Yeah, it's tricky because you mentioned switching up the track listing potentially. As much as I think that might help the album a bit, I think changing up what they had before would also be a disservice to what the pace of the album was, because the first 8 tracks on this album, I wouldn't really place it any differently. I think each song leads into the other quite well. Maybe the one switch you can make is switch Lady in My Life with The Girl Is Mine, and then end the album with that outro of Paul and Michael having that conversation. But yeah, the song, it's not bad. I'm not about to trash it. And there's, out of the classic albums that we have reviewed on this podcast, there's very few songs that I would consider to be in a bad category, where I don't think
Absolutely.
there's anything like salvageable about it. Maybe Freeform Guitar and Chicago Transit Authority, because that's like not really a song. It's more of like hearing a guitar being
It's
tuned.
it's more of like a musical experience than a song, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I feel like it's an album closer that you can kind of drift off to. If I was listening to it on a vinyl record, I might kind of forget the songs playing, and
Mm-hmm.
then all of a sudden I hear the needle going towards the end. I'm like, okay, I need to take it out. So
Yeah,
it's definitely the least interesting of the album, and that's not to say it's bad. It's just there isn't really much to break down. There isn't really anything that stands out to me as much. I know it is a quite popular track with some people though, and that they do enjoy the lyrics a lot. So I can see that argument for sure. But personally, it's just in an album with so many bangers and so many songs that are iconic and so integral to pop culture. This one's just kind of eh. It leaves off on a note where I'm like, oh, the album's over. Oh, okay, time to move on.
agreed. Agreed. It's one of those where I definitely see where you're coming from with the arrangement. It's one of those where you almost wonder, would it be better fit on another album and switched with another track from another album, or with one additional song on the end of it, rather than this
Or like
being
as
the
a bonus
close.
track, perhaps.
Yeah, yes. On one of those where it's like a remastered deluxe set type, which I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think actually one of those was done uh, of Thriller, but I have to double check on that. I'm
Mm-hmm.
going off of distant memory on this, so I could be completely inaccurate. But the yeah, it was like I said, it's kind of like we've mentioned baseball a couple times. It's kind of like if you've got an all-star lineup and your number 9 hitter is batting 280.
It's Peter
Like
Borges, somebody like
Peter
that.
Peter Boyd. Yeah, it's someone you most a lot of teams would welcome onto their team, but just in the context of what's around it, um, it doesn't it kind of just doesn't fit the party in a sense.
Yeah, I agree. And I guess that kind of wraps up our discussion of the track by track items for this album. So I guess it's going to bring us into our general thoughts. Although we've said a lot of bigger picture things about the album, what's like your thesis? What's your final analysis of the album?
Mhm. Um, so I'll kind of restate what I said before in that there are some or rather some records that I listen to all the tracks, but there's just no upstaging the title track for me, and Thriller is no different. I think going through this, I enjoy the sort of myriad different mental and sort of um, almost psychological journey trips that you can kind of go through because you've got a little bit of love, you got a little bit of passion, you got a little bit of intense sort of urgency and thriller. You've got um, a bit of fire in a song like "Beat It."
And
You
even in the
got
lady of my life, you got a little bit
yeah,
of reflection too.
yes, you got and then of course songs like "Human Nature" and "This Girl Is Mine." You've got more um, passion and longing and reverence. I think is a good way to sort of tie that up in a neat little bow. Is just reverence for this object of and this the object of his desire and this woman that he's clearly infatuated with. So I think if I'm looking at the entirety of the album, honestly, it made me respect Michael Jackson even more than I already did as a musician because I got through this album. Now, I sometimes struggle with artists that are not among my like absolute favorites, like Bruce Springsteen, Fleetwood Mac. I sometimes struggle keeping track of what tracks are on which records. So when I was going through this and I got to the end and I wasn't really paying attention to my phone when it was playing, and I thought, wait a second, where's this song? Where's this song? Where's this song? And I realized how much of a blockbuster this album was and didn't even include some of my favorite songs and some of his most well-known songs on it, which I had a similar reaction to Billy Joel when we covered his
Hmm.
um, album The Stranger, and I thought, wow, I'm at the end of this, where's Uptown Girl? Where's um,
The
you know
longest time.
yeah, the longest time? Where's Angry Young Man, which I think is an underrated one that I personally really love. Um, I, and it made me just tip my cap to what he was able to accomplish and like I said, not just as a songwriter and as a musician, but as a uh, I guess a media celebrity in a sense because there's some and this is going to be a bit out of left field, but you look at him, you look at Prince, you look at Liberace. There's certain performers that you just don't get the full effect. Elvis, another one. You don't get a. I feel like you don't get the full effect unless you're actually watching them perform these tracks. And I think that Michael Jackson, if there was ever a billboard of that type of uh, that area of music, I think that his face would be perfect right on the front of that because um, there's some of these songs you there's just such an energy and a vibrance and an intensity um, and uh, an aura and just so much energy that comes out of watching those types of or those clips of him putting the whole show together for those 4 or 5 minutes, as opposed to just hearing it in the car, which where you can appreciate it, but you're not really connecting fully with not just your ears, but your mind, your limbs, your heart, all of it. is not really able to sink into the music as much as it may be in other settings.
Yeah, I think you put everything together really well there. And I agree across the board. I think this is definitely one of the most essential and important albums in music history. Not just in rock, not just in pop, not just in funk, but just in overall music history. It was such a groundbreaking achievement, I think. And there's a reason why it's most popular. And it's going to sound basic here to sing the praises because it's such a critically acclaimed and highly regarded album. But I sincerely think that there is totally a reason why it is, and it's completely deserved. It's kind of in the vein of Rumors, where there's so many tracks on here that are hits. It almost feels like a greatest hits album. And there's very few, only one or two on the album, that are remotely skippable or ignorable. And I also love how succinct this album is too. Coming in at 36 minutes for the entire record, it's not going to consume your entire day to listen to it. Like two of my favorite albums are Tusk and the Beatles' White Album. And both of those are experiences. You have to like really dive in. And there's some tracks on there that don't quite land, but you're looking at 20 tracks or 30 tracks. And if 16 of them are great, or if 25 or 26 of them are great, then it's a huge success. With this album, because it was so much shorter, I think you needed that level of success and that level of energy to be sustained through the entire thing. And I think it's really impressive and definitely re-listenable, definitely something you'll hear on a consistent basis on any radio station or at any gathering. So I'm glad this album exists, and I'm glad that it's one of the most successful ones too. And say what you want about Michael Jackson as a person. There's a lot of stuff that makes me feel all weirded out and uncomfortable, but if you're able to put that aside and just listen to the music and the production from Quincy Jones, as well as the songwriting contributions, I think it's just a remarkable album. Maybe not in my top 10 of all time, but I think in terms of quality, it's definitely up there.
I would agree with that. I think the spans and just the not only from a musical standpoint and beyond everything that I've already discussed, the cultural significance of this record. You think of people in the last 30 or 40 years. The pop. Obviously, the king of pop, but you think of artists since him. I mentioned one of my all-time favorites, Prince, and others like him. There's so many people who, when they list, they're asked to list, their main inspirations as musicians or in songwriting or performing. He's a name that you'll hear quite often, and I think from that standpoint, from the standpoint of, like we mentioned before, the integration of someone who was an American music icon and someone who was a stalwart in the Black community to speak to reaching out on songs that were very perceived as very unifying and very again cultural anthem types. I can think of "We Are the World." I can think of "Black or White." He really integrated that into his discography, and I think that even some 30, 40 years later, a lot of that holds on quite well.
Definitely. And I guess that kind of wraps up our discussion on Thriller, Michael Jackson's iconic album, best-selling record of all time. So thank you everybody for listening today. And remember to be kind to each other and especially reach out to other people during this time and stay safe and healthy. Thank you, Brian, for joining us today.
Thank you, Noah. Stay well, everybody. Wash your hands.
Exactly. And hand sanitizer, masks, everything. Don't be an anti-masker. Don't do it. And we'll be back with another episode coming soon. We got some very exciting artists to cover, and some new genres to touch on too. And just stay here on the YouTube channel for updates. And we'll see you next time.
So long, everyone.